warning ahead of time, this presentation will be heavy on facts and risks and pretty light on myths and best practices. So if you didn't get enough of the other two, you can throw some questions at me afterwards. Let's see if this works. It does. Big picture overview, state of Arizona. These are its water sources. 36% of all the water we consume in the state comes from the Colorado River. That number is declining. As you all know, if you've been paying attention to the news, the CAP has lost about 30% of its allocation last year, and a second-tier shortage is about to be declared, and we will be losing more of it. So that 36% is going to be down to 33 or 30. Groundwater is 40%, the single largest source of water consumption in Arizona. That number will be going up. We have no other alternative. As our river waters lose some of the water that's flowing in them, we'll be making up for it with groundwater, probably. In-state rivers, the Salt, the Verde, the Agua Fria, the Gila, those make up 21%, and only 3% reclaimed water. That's water that we take from our waste treatment facilities and put it into golf courses or wetlands. That's a lot. I think that's a good use of reclaimed water, is to create wetlands and wildlife habitat. But anyway, here in Cochise County, because we're just a little piece of Arizona, 99% of everybody is dependent on groundwater. I only say 99% because people like Linda and I have a spring that provides our water supply. And I imagine there's probably a few other people in Cochise County that have spring water, but all the rest of you, raise your hand if you have a well, and all your water comes from a well. Raise your hand if it does not, if you have something else like a spring. There you go. Me and Linda, we're the only ones. So when groundwater goes dry, you know where to come to fill up your water bottles, right? If we have any spring water. Just a sort of a visual representation of an aquifer. You know, in the upper zone, just below the surface and the vegetation, it's generally dry, and you got to drill a ways before you hit water. You hit a saturated zone. And where that saturated zone is, it's loaded with rocks and gravel and silt and sand and clay. And that's all sort of saturated with water. And when you drill a well down there, you're sucking water up from the spaces in between all that gravel and rock and sand. When we pump groundwater, here's your little well, and bring water from below in the aquifer up to the surface for providing water for cities or for farms or for businesses, if you're pumping more water than is naturally being replaced, that aquifer declines. Your groundwater table will fall. Declining groundwater is a common problem all around the world. It's an issue in Africa. It's a terrible issue in India. It's an issue in Central Asia. And it's an issue all over the American West. This is a USGS map showing where groundwater is declining versus where groundwater is rising, where the water table is actually getting greater. And the only place where you see groundwater coming up is right there. Does anybody want to guess as to why in those two swatches groundwater table is getting higher instead of lower?
Snake River dams?
That's the Snake River Plain, and that's the second largest irrigation region in the Pacific Northwest. That's the Columbia River Basin, and that's the largest irrigation region in the American West. Both of those are diverting river water to spread out over these irrigated farms. That river water then, some of it seeps down into the ground and fills the aquifer. So where you have irrigation dependent on rivers, the groundwater table is actually coming up in many cases. Other parts of the arid American West, which is pretty much everywhere else, a lot of our agriculture is based on pumped groundwater, and in all of those places, the aquifer is declining. So this bright orange is where anywhere from 50 to 150 cubic kilometers of water have been withdrawn from the aquifer in, I think that's over a 10-year period. So with the falling water table, what do we get? What are some of the impacts? Anybody with a shallow well is at risk of losing their water, and they have to drill a deeper well if the groundwater table is declining. I know lots of you, when you get your well put in, LBROC will come out, and they'll tell you at what point they hit water, and then they'll drill a little bit deeper, maybe 15, 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 feet deeper. Sometimes more than that, but often for domestic wells, they'll just go an extra 20, 30, 40 feet. If the water table is dropping at the rate of a foot a year, you're going to be out of water pretty soon. And if it's dropping faster than that, you're going to be in trouble. Shallower wells are going to start going dry, and they actually have. I'll tell you about that in a minute. A lot of trees are dependent on that groundwater. And in a river valley or Cave Creek here, that's a saturated water table where the creek is. When the creek is flowing, that means that the groundwater is saturated, and that creek can't soak into the ground and disappear anymore because it's fully saturated. As that water sinks down, the creek will disappear. It will go with the water table level. If you're pumping a lot from a river basin and that groundwater table drops, the trees that need to be in that saturated water lose their access to water and die. And the streams and the rivers that are also flowing will sink beneath the surface and stop flowing if you pump too much groundwater. With lots of groundwater depletion, so to understand land subsidence, think about a sponge on your kitchen sink. You've just done the dishes after dinner. The sponge is wet and it's fully expanded, nice and big and square. You wake up the next morning, go into the kitchen, and it's dried out and it's shrunk. It's in a little bit of a cave-in it, and it's much thinner than it was when it was wet. You put water on it and it expands again. Aquifers are kind of similar to that. A saturated aquifer is in its most expanded situation. When you drain the water from that aquifer, the sediment compacts. It begins to sink. And we get what's called land subsidence. And you can measure with satellites how much our valleys have sunken. You can measure it in inches. And I'm going to show you a map in a little while to show you how much the valleys around San Simon and Bowie have shrunk just in the last 15 years from groundwater depletion. Whoops, wrong way. This is an example of what happens when you get land subsidence. You get these big fissures opening up. So imagine you've been hiking through the desert and there's a playa or a mud flat that was filled with water, and after everything dried out, the surface of that mud flat starts to dry out and crack, and you get these little plates of mud with spaces in between them. That's what's happening when an aquifer is being depleted. You get subsidence and you get fissures opening up. There's fissures opening up all over the American West in places where we have excess groundwater depletion. This is from the Sulphur Springs Valley on the other side of the Chiricahuas in the Wilcox area. Now, fissures don't just open up out in the desert. They cross roads. This is Highway 191 in the Sulphur Springs Valley, heading south from I-10. And the county and the state have to constantly close the road and try to shore it up again because of all this land subsidence. There's a wonderful story up in Phoenix. You know the great Central Arizona Project Canal that brings Colorado River water from the California border all the way to Phoenix and then on to Tucson. In North Phoenix, the CAP Canal runs through an area in far north Scottsdale. And there was an area that had a lot of agricultural production and a lot of ground subsidence, and cracks keep opening up. One time, one of these big fissures opened up underneath the CAP canal, cracked the cement that holds it, and the CAP canal emptied into the surrounding neighborhood. And it took them weeks to fix it. So you can undermine buildings, bridges can be closed. It's a serious problem. Subsidence can be a serious problem to infrastructure. We get a diminishment of our community water supplies. Everybody in Douglas and Bisbee gets their water from the ground, from municipal wells that are provided then to households. They're dependent on wells too. if wells are going dry, municipalities have to keep drilling deeper and deeper and charging more and more for the water. The deeper you go in the aquifer, quite often the more salts and sediments and concentrated minerals you find in that water. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But there is some risk to water quality the deeper you go into the aquifer. It's not cleaner water down there, it's saltier water down there. And here in the San Simon Basin, we have a lot of arsenic and, well, yeah, right around here we have an awful lot of iron. But down in the valley, there's a couple of other, well, I'll get to that with another slide. And remember, this is kind of a common pool resource. There's one aquifer down there, and everybody is pumping from it. And if you're pumping an excessive amount, you're going to be affecting how much water your neighbor has. So, 50, 60 years ago, farmers in central Arizona, Maricopa County, were suing other farmers because they were, quote unquote, you're taking my water. So one farmer would be in business for a generation and doing just fine, and then somebody else would come in, buy the land next door, put in a deeper well, pump even more water, and then suddenly this farmer lost his water, and he couldn't afford to drill it deeper. So he sued his neighbor for taking his business and his property. The state has been trying to deal with these conflict problems for a long time, and it's very difficult, as you can imagine, to resolve that. But it can lead to conflicts among neighbors when you start getting groundwater depletion at that level. And of course, the deeper the water table goes, the more expensive it is to get at it, and the more unlikely it is that you'll be able to attract new farmers, businesses, real estate development, all the things that we sort of expect in terms of economic growth become harder and harder to support as the water table drops farther and farther and the cost of getting that water increases. You have an uncertain future. Real quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there are a lot of people that think the groundwater is constantly being replenished and we don't have to worry about it. It's not going to run out. We know for a fact that you can deplete aquifers if you're pumping more than is being replenished. There are a lot of people over in the Sulphur Springs Valley who have heard this story from some mining engineer from 40 years ago who claimed he came from like the Great Lakes and he came out looking for minerals, oil and gas in particular, and was drilling these deep wells. And this person came up with this story saying that everywhere he went from the Great Lakes to southern Arizona, he drilled down at a certain depth and ran into an abundance of water. And he hypothesized that there was this great underground river running from the Great Lakes all the way to the Sea of Cortez. And so there's people in the Sulphur Springs Valley who don't want to have to worry about groundwater regulation who are saying, we can't run out of water, there's a great river under there, and all we have to do is tap into it. There are a lot of people who think, well, I've got 40 acres and my well isn't going to affect anybody but me. And that's not true, depending on how much you're pumping. Finally, some of you here in the room were at a presentation a month and a half ago by a guy named Mark Burr of Primary Water Technologies. And he's pitching this idea that there's water deep in the mantle of the earth, the lower crust, and in the mantle of the earth, there's oceans worth of fresh water down there. And that with special gamma ray machines that he has, he can tell you exactly where to drill so that you can tap into that primary water. And he says it's unlimited, undepletable, and pure. And that all of our water woes will be solved if everybody hires him to tell them where to drill. And he's going to tell you where you can drill down and find a crack in the earth where primary water is coming up from the mantle. So a bunch of us here have investigated this, and I can tell you it's all complete bunk. It's complete hokum. There is primary water in the mantle of the earth. There are probably 2 oceans worth of H2O, but it's 300 to 400 miles, 300 to 400 miles beneath the surface of the earth. It's under great pressure and temperature. It's bound up with rocks, and it's in a crystalline form, and it does not seep through cracks in the earth to replenish our aquifer. Primary water technology people say the water in the aquifer didn't come from the sky. It didn't come from rain and snow. It's coming up from below, from these fissures in the earth, from primary water. And it's constantly being replenished, and it's not depletable. Don't believe it. Now, he can tell you about where you're going to hit water and about how much you're going to be able to pump. But anybody with a drill who's been in the business for a while can tell you the same thing. All you do is you look at on, public websites, you can see how deep each property owner's well is and what the capacity of their well is, and you can ask around. How deep did you drill your well? 325 feet. How much can you pump? 20 gallons per minute. So if you drill a 325-foot well, 100 feet or 100 yards or a quarter mile away, you're probably going to hit water at about 325 feet. So it's no mystery. Anyway, we can come back to that if anybody heard the presentation and they want to ask additional questions. Let's get back to the facts. The green outline is the San Simon sub-basin. So we actually drain into the Gila River, so the water flows north. That green there shows you what's referred to as the San Simon sub-basin, groundwater basin. You can see here we are in Portal, Paradise, Rodeo, Apache, I-10, San Simon, and Bowie. So it's a fairly big sub-basin, and most of the agriculture is up here along I-10. We'll be looking at a lot of that in just a second. This is the flow of groundwater, not the flow of surface water, but groundwater does flow very slowly. It moves through the aquifer. Most of our groundwater basins are not entirely confined. Some are, but not all of them are. And groundwater does flow to the south from the Portal area and into the valley, and then up north towards San Simon. Some of it goes east, some of it goes west. Much of it continues on up to the Gila River. So just like surface water, groundwater is going to be flowing in the same direction. Very slowly, though. This is from Arizona Department of Water Resources, their conceptual cross-section of the San Simon aquifer. This is bedrock, so here's our mountains up here. And a bedrock goes all the way down to the valley and then on up to the next mountain range. The Palencia's over here. And all of this is alluvial fill from millions of years of erosion and deposition. And some of it's gravel, some of it's really rocky over here by the mountain front, but the farther you get down in the valley, the more finer sediments are out there. And there is, some millions of years ago, fine sediment was blown in from dry lakes and accumulated in this big thick layer of clay. Clay is mostly impermeable. It's very hard for water to get through clay because it's so fine. And so the San Simon Basin actually has two aquifers that are only tenuously attached near the base of the mountain ranges. But for most of the valley, there's this deep clay unit. In some cases, it's a couple of 100 feet thick. Other places, it's a little bit thinner. But there's an upper aquifer and a lower aquifer. And the upper aquifer is fairly shallow. At no place is the upper aquifer any deeper than about 400 feet. All of your wells, unless you're a farmer and you're irrigating and you have a deep, high-capacity well, all of your wells are tapping the upper aquifer. This is important because a few slides down the road, I'm going to tell you about Arizona Department of Water Resources' conclusion that the upper aquifer is going to be dewatered sometime in the next 100 years at current rates of pumping from agriculture. And they don't think that's a problem, as I'll tell you in a minute, because there's more aquifer down here for those who can afford to drill through the clay layer. Quality, I mentioned. This is my only water quality slide. It's from a 2004 study by the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. Every place where you see blue, the water quality in that tested well is good. It meets all health standards. And you can see down by Portal, pretty much everything is blue. There's a couple of yellows. That means that It exceeded secondary water quality standards, but all the reds farther north by I-10 and where the agriculture is, the wells there don't meet human health standards. They have to be treated to be drunk safely. Groundwater in the lower aquifer, which they call an artesian aquifer for reasons I'm not clear, rarely met their health-based standards because of frequently elevated fluoride and arsenic concentrations. So as you drill down through the clay layer into the lower aquifer, you're getting lower quality water. It costs a whole lot more to pump it up, so it's a lot more expensive, and you're going to have to treat it before you can drink it. So we don't really want to have to depend on that lower aquifer. If we can keep the upper aquifer healthy and keep it from being dewatered, that's going to be good for all of us. So most of the water that's pumped out of the ground is pumped for irrigation agriculture. Probably 90% of the water that's pumped out of the ground in Cochise County is for agriculture. We don't have any big cities. It takes about 3 times as much water per acre for a crop as it does for a housing development. It's one of the reasons why Phoenix is not doing so bad in its water supply, because every time they converted an old farm into housing development, they had 3 times as much water as they had before. So that's why they were able to grow to 5 million people. And as I'll show you in a slide, they have more water. They're consuming less water now than they were in 1980 because there's less agriculture. Isn't that amazing? So here in the San Simon Valley sub-basin in 2014, 63% of pumped groundwater for farmers was for orchards. And you all know that you've seen these pecan farms going in, some pistachios, but mostly pecans, some walnuts. Alfalfa is a really huge chunk. That's for livestock fodder. Corn is fairly significant, oats and barley, etc. That was 2014. Here's a chart showing the amount of acres of irrigated agriculture in the San Simon Basin going back to 1991. And you can see it was pretty stable all the way up until 2010. And then all of a sudden, investors started coming in because land is cheap and water is unregulated. And they started buying up land in Bowie, San Simon, south of San Simon towards the Chiricahuas along that Foothills Road, Nolan Road. Tons of pecan farms have gone in there recently. That's what you're seeing here. And that only takes us up to 2014. We've had 8 more years of development since then. I'm sorry I don't have a graph showing what's happened in the last 8 years, but it's only continued to expand. These are the types of crops that are being grown up by I-10. And you can see all the blue stuff are young pecans. So you got future pecans, young pecans, and mature pecans. There's so many pecan orchards going in, they had to color code, young, future, and mature differently. But so you can see most of that. Green.
If you can't reach, you got a pointer.
Oh yeah, I do have a pointer. All the blue stuff there and more. So you'll see a lot of green here. That's alfalfa. Now the next slide is right here by us. Here's Portal. And you can see those center pivot farms just to the northeast of Portal. That's all corn and alfalfa. Those are among the highest consumptive crops that you can grow. Barley is a low consumptive crop in comparison to corn and alfalfa. In the future, if we need to start making decisions about what kinds of crops are more sustainable over the long term, we're probably going to have to start phasing out things like alfalfa and corn. I've got a blow-up of this, so I'm only going to talk about it for a second and then show you the blow-up. This is from 2007 to 2015, the water level change in feet of, these are wells. Each one of those is a well. And they're measuring whether the water table in that well is dropping or rising. And everywhere that you see a blue, you see some up here, the water level in that well has come up between 2007 and 2015. But everywhere that you see red, it's gone down. Here's the more of a blow up. Here's Portal right here. And up here is San Simon. So you can see most of the agriculture is up in this area. And nearly all of the wells have shown a decline in those years. Anybody want to take a guess why there's a few that are showing blue along in here? I had to read the full report to figure this out. I was wondering.
Because farms got converted to subdivisions.
No. Great guess. If this was Phoenix, you'd be absolutely right. Bing, bing, bing. No, there's no subdivisions in San Simon or Bowie.
Is that where the playas are?
Nope, that's not where the playas are. That's another good guess, Greg. All right, remember I said there's 2 aquifers, and farmers who have enough money will drill down into the lower aquifer. So those blue places are where farmers have pumped from the lower aquifer, brought the water up, spread it out to irrigate crops, and it has soaked down into the upper aquifer. All right, this is, again, I'm going to show you 4 quick graphs. These are very specific wells, and they're showing how the water level in the wells have changed. The red arrow there tells you which well is being represented here. This is the most stark one. That's up near Bowie, just north of the town of Bowie and I-10, where there's an awful lot of irrigation agriculture. And this map shows this is about 1950. You can't see the numbers, but this is about 1950 or so. This is the 60s. This is the 90s, and this is the present right here, like 2015. And so you can see each one of these lines on this graph is 100 feet. So this well, the static water level in this well fell from 1 to almost 300 feet in those decades from pumping. This well is from just to the northeast side of the Chiricahuas, south of I-10, but north of Portal, and you can see the steady decline in this one. Now, this is a different scale, so that's not hundreds of feet. This is only a drop of about 50 feet over that same period, but again, you can see the trajectory there. This one is right across from Paradise and Portal on the New Mexico side here, and you can see the same sort of precipitous decline with a few blips. And so this is, pretty typical. This one, I think, is interesting. This is down here by Rodeo or south of Rodeo. And you can see that, the static level was pretty high back in the 50s, and then they started pumping like crazy and it dropped, and it stayed low for a while. And then I'm not sure why they maybe switched crops, or they went from flood irrigation to sprinkler irrigation. There's all kinds of ways of making irrigation more efficient. There was a shift in crops or efficiency, and the water table came back up and then has been stable at this level for a while. So we're not stuck with a declension. We can actually, through positive action, we can make positive changes in groundwater levels. If we see a problem, a deep drop, we can change our behavior and fix that problem. This is a satellite image. I just wanted to show you these center pivot farms. This is like you drill a super deep well and you attach a center pivot to it, and you have these sprinklers on an arm that just go around in a circle, and they create these crop circles like this. Those are some of the most irrigation intensive types of farming methods, and you see lots of them up here south of San Simon, a fair amount up here by Bowie. The square ones are more orchards. But look over here in the Sulphur Springs Valley. This is the Wilcox Playa here. We're going to talk a whole bunch about what's going on over here, because it's just a hop, skip, and a jump from the Sulphur Springs Valley over to our valley here. So I'm paying a lot of attention to what's going on here for that reason. I mentioned land subsidence before. This is a map showing land subsidence in the San Simon Basin. Here's I-10, Bowie, and San Simon. And you can see land subsidence comes way down. Here's Hilltop. Paradise is going to be about right here, and this is Foothills Road. So you can see we're already experiencing some land subsidence way down here. But of course, up a little farther where all that big cropping agriculture is, we've got land subsidence of from anywhere from 1 inch to 15 inches. That is, the surface of the earth has dropped as much as a foot.
Over how much time?
This is 2006 to 2015. So this is just one decade. And we're almost another decade. So the land subsidence is going to be much worse today than it was in 2015. All right. So I'm going to digress as a historian and tell you a little bit about the groundwater code. We have a groundwater management code in Arizona. It's not enforced very aggressively. So I'm personally disappointed in how poorly it's been implemented, but it has made a difference. We're much better off now than we were in 1980 in the parts of the state that had the worst groundwater overdraft. And we can use that law to our advantage in rural parts of Arizona. It's just never been done before. And I'll go through that history for you right now. So why did we get a strong groundwater code, the Arizona Groundwater Management Act, in 1980? Well, Arizonans had been asking the federal government to pay for this thing called the Central Arizona Project Canal for decades, from the 1950s on, finally got it authorized by Congress in 1968. It didn't get completed until the 1980s. 1986, the CAP Canal made it to Phoenix. 1993, before it made it to Tucson. So from the 1930s, when it was first being discussed, until 1993, that's how long Arizonans fought to get the federal government and national taxpayers to reach into their pockets and pay for this giant water delivery system, bringing Colorado River water from the California border to Phoenix and Tucson. Well, it had been authorized in 1968, but not much of it had been built yet, in part because California kept stalling the funding mechanism, because California didn't really want Arizona to get that Colorado River water, because California had already built their delivery and diversion systems. They were already taking more than their allocation, more than their legal allocation of Colorado River water. And the minute that other states were able to take their full allocation, California would have to cut back. So they were doing all kinds of things to make it difficult to get the project built. Arizonans, all the politicians banded together to make sure it was built. And then Jimmy Carter gets elected. He had had a couple of run-ins with the Army Corps of Engineers in Georgia when he was governor of Georgia. They wanted to build these big water engineering projects, and he's an engineer, by the way. And he'd read through their 600-page environmental impact statement about these projects, and he'd look at their economic analysis, and he walked into the chief of the Army Corps of Engineers office and said, "This is bullshit. This is an unjustifiable project. Why are you proposing this?" Well, it was all politics. That's, as Mark Reisner said, water politics is the grease that makes the machinery of American politics work. So when he became president, he and his staff decided, you know what, let's take a look at all the water projects still on the books, the ones that haven't been built yet, and let's do a real evaluation about whether they're needed. Do they make economic sense? Are their cost-benefit analysis decent? Do they make environmental sense? Who are they going to serve? And they came up with a list of water projects that they thought should be canceled. And of course, as soon as they, said, we want to cancel all these water projects, every single congressman and congresswoman who had a water project in their district rose up in opposition and just gave him holy hell. So Carter, being a reasonable guy, said, okay, we'll go back to the drawing board, and I'll prioritize the worst 10 projects. And that was referred to as Jimmy Carter's Western Water Projects hit list. These 10 projects, he said, make no sense on any ground. We're not going to fund them. And of course, he had huge opposition to that. But guess what was on that top 10 list? The Central Arizona Project Canal, which, for those of you who don't know, was the most expensive water project in American history when it was built. We never spent any more money on any other water project anywhere in the United States, including channelizing the Mississippi River, than they spent on the CAP Canal. So it's on his hit list, and Jimmy Carter and Cecil Andrus, who was Secretary of the Interior, went to Bruce Babbitt, who was governor of Arizona. They're all Democrats, so they'll talk to each other. And Babbitt said, what's it going to take to get this project off your hit list and get it funded? And Carter basically said, look, you guys have had a problem with overconsumption of water. You've been, draining your groundwater, and there's going to be crises. And I don't see you doing anything about it. Said, if you show me that you're serious about water sustainability, that you're willing to get serious about managing your groundwater resources that you're so heavily reliant on in a sustainable way, then we'll consider turning the spigot back on, the water spigot. So Babbitt convened this rump group with the developers, the farmers, the real estate people, the mining industry, all these big movers and shakers, and they drafted, in less than a year, they drafted the Arizona Groundwater Management Act. And it passed through the state legislature with no debate and no amendments. And that's because they were trying to save the CAP. And everybody realized if we don't get the feds to pay for this, we'll never get that water because we can never pay for it. So that's why we had the Arizona Groundwater Management Act. At the time, it was considered one of the most progressive groundwater management codes in the United States. It's maybe in the top 10 now, because other states like California have done a better job. So what are its key provisions? First, it designated 5 active management areas where the greatest amount of groundwater overdraft had been occurring, which was also the places where most of the urban population of Arizona lived. And here they were. These are the original 5 active management areas. Phoenix and Tucson, of course. Then Pinal County was agricultural. And then Santa Cruz was Nogales, and Prescott's Prescott. So about 75% of Arizona's population lives inside those active management areas. They did not designate any other areas of the state as active management areas. The only place where the Groundwater Management Act applies is in the active management areas. So that means the rest of the state is unregulated, the Wild West. Other key provisions, and this was 1980, they were generous. So the crafters of the bill said, by 2025, was that 45 years, you have almost half a century to get your act together. By 2025, we want to see safe yield of groundwater in those active management areas. Now, safe yield does not even mean a stable or increasing aquifer. It just means that the rate of depletion has slowed down enough that we'll probably have water for 100 years. They also added this 100-year assured water supply for developments. If you're a developer and you buy 100 acres on the outskirts of Phoenix and you want to develop it, you have to show ADWR, Arizona Department of Water Resources, you have to show ADWR that you have at least 100 years of assured water supply before you can sell homes. Now, those homeowners, and year 101, who knows? But this was the best they could do. Safe yield a half a century later and a 100-year assured water supply for developments. By the way, none of the active management areas will reach safe yield by 2025. They've only got 3 years left to go. Tucson's the closest. None of the other ones are close. They made progress, but they're not going to get safe yield. There's been a fairly weak commitment to the law, especially when Republicans are in charge, because they don't like government regulation. We all know that. Lots of loopholes and evasions, but there's nothing else that we have on the books that we can use to try to protect groundwater. So what about, so modest success. I think you'll find this very interesting. This was, this thing here is the population of Arizona, and you can see how the population from 1957 to 2017 rose dramatically. And the bar is economic, GDP for Arizona. So the population has been rising significantly. Our economy has been growing significantly. This line here is the amount of water that we're consuming to support that population and economy. And you can see 1980 was the year where we consumed the most amount of water in our state's history. And it started slowly declining and leveling off in the last decade or so. So those who want to be optimistic can say, see, we can have population growth and economic growth and still cut back on our water consumption to try to reach sustainability. So in that sense, you can say, all right, we've made some progress. But the fact that we haven't reached safe yield and that none of the other parts of the state have any protections at all tells me that we should be more worried than we should be happy. All right, so outside AMAs, there's virtually no regulation. It's just the doctrine of reasonable use. And, anybody's guess what reasonable means and the amount of water that you want to consume. So we've had just dozens and dozens and dozens of articles in rural Arizona about declining groundwater tables from the increase in agricultural production we've seen in the last 20 years. There's one example. This is another interesting chart put together by Arizona Department of Water Resources showing 1993 to 2013. The blue is where the water table has come up. The red and peach is where the water table has gone down. Anybody want to take a guess what explains this interesting line here? Huh? What? CAP Canal. So the CAP comes off the Colorado River up here, and it runs down to Phoenix and then on down to Tucson. There was a lot of water in the CAP Canal that was not being directly consumed by farmers in cities right away, and so they took that excess water and they banked it underground. Now, most of that water got banked underground near where the CAP Canal was because that's where the excess water was. And so all along the CAP Canal has been a ton of water banking by cities and by the state and et cetera. And so we've actually seen the water table come up in some of those areas. Everywhere that doesn't have access to the CAP Canal is seeing very serious water aquifer declines. All right, watch this. That's 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020. Every one of those dots is a new well being drilled. New homeowners, new farmers. This is the San Simon Valley. There's Wilcox right there. This is where the crisis is right now. And just watch over 40 years. The big yellow ones are big irrigation agricultural wells drilled down 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet. The smaller ones are domestic wells or small farms that pump 35 gallons per minute or less. Keep this in mind. Even in an active management area, if your well capacity is 35 gallons per minute or less, you're not regulated. You're exempt from regulation. The only wells that have to report their usage and that are subject to regulations are wells that have capacity of 35 gallons per minute or more. So you can see what's been going on, especially in the last 20 years, 2010 and 2020, and it hasn't stopped. This is a graphic from an article in Arizona Central. This is an actual family homestead, and they had a 400-foot well, and they were next door to a family farm, which was next door to a big corporate farm, and they lost their well and had to drill a 600-foot deep well to get water again. And they're wondering how long that's going to last. This is an average depth for a family-type farm. This is Riverview Farms that's drilling to 1,000, 1,500. In some cases, they have a couple of wells down to 2,000 feet. As they drain the aquifer to grow corn and alfalfa for Coronado Dairy, every one of their neighbors is at risk of losing their wells. Aerial view of the Sulphur Springs Valley. So in 2014, a whole bunch of small farmers and businesses saw the handwriting on the wall and said, we need some groundwater pumping regulation, or these big corporate, out of state. So Riverview Farms, by the way, is from Minnesota. And they saw, cheap land and unregulated water, and they started buying farms. They bought thousands and thousands of acres of farmland in the Sulphur Springs Valley, and they put in these gigantic center pivot corn and alfalfa fields for Coronado Dairy. So local farmers who'd been there for a long time and local homesteaders decided we need some kind of regulation. They asked the Arizona Department of Water Resources to help them. They thought that getting an active management area designation might be too political. And so they started holding these public meetings and negotiating neighbor to neighbor to try to come up with some sort of a plan that wouldn't use the Groundwater Management Act because it's a hammer. It's got, specific requirements in it, they came up with something they call a groundwater conservation area that would have a little bit more local control and a little bit less authority to actually make changes that were needed. And after 3 years of work on it, they got a bill drafted, legislature wouldn't pass it, and the whole effort the community effort put into it completely dissolved in acrimony. You know, some people came in one time and said, "Who the hell are you saying you can speak for us? We don't want any government regulation." And everybody just said, "Okay, that's it," and walked away. So in 2015, 3 years of effort fell apart, and nothing has happened since then, except for more wells and more irrigation. Similar effort in the San Simon Valley, right across the mountains. A bunch of farmers that have been around for a very long time started noticing that out-of-state California corporations were coming in, buying land and putting in nut farms, which require a tremendous amount of irrigation. They were concerned about the viability of their groundwater that they depended on. And there's a feature in the Arizona Groundwater Management Act that says, in lieu of an active management area, you can create an INA, an irrigation non-expansion area. And it's an area where it's mostly agricultural use, not a big city with a lot of population. And it's the local farmers that are there that try to get an INA designated so that no new irrigation can come in and take away the water that they're dependent on. So a whole bunch of farmers in the San Simon Valley petitioned ADWR to designate an INA. ADWR did a bunch of studies, which is where a whole bunch of my graphs in this presentation came from. It was a great big study you can find online by their hydrologist. And after about 9 months of research, the director of the Department of Water Resources said, "No, we don't think there's a justification for designating an irrigation non-expansion area." And his rationale for that was that the statute, the Arizona Groundwater Management Act, says for an INA to be designated, you have to show that there's a risk of running out of water before 100 years is up at current rates of pumping. So they did a study and they looked at the aquifer and they said, well, the upper aquifer is probably going to dewater in 100 years, within the next 100 years, but there's enough water in the lower aquifer that if you just drill down deeper, you'll be able to keep pumping at current rates of pumping for at least 100 years. At the end of 100 years, the water table will be around 400 feet below the surface, and there'll still be some water there. So they said, so we can't regulate. So that whole effort went to naught because they were asking the Department of Water Resources to do something to help them, and ADWR wouldn't. Here's a passage from the director of ADWR's decision, and I just want you to meditate on this for a second. Largely because the upper aquifer above the clay layer is relatively thin, the department's groundwater model predicts dewatering in portions of the upper aquifer during the 100 years of agricultural pumping at current rates. However, the department is not aware of any significant impediment that would prevent the extension of shallow wells into the lower system. So basically, you're going to lose the upper aquifer, but drill deeper and you can still have water, so we're not going to do anything. Now, all of the homeowners are in the upper aquifer. So who are they talking to? They're not talking to you. They're not trying to protect you. Because the only people that can drill an 800-foot well or a 1,000-foot well and afford the electricity of pumping that out to irrigate are big, deep-pocketed corporate farmers. And that's who ADWR is acting on behalf of. Remember this. Here's an example. ADWR is basically saying we're not going to do anything to help you because if this goes dry, you can drill a well that deep. So, good luck. Well, our state so the State Department of Water Resources has not been very helpful. Is our state legislature helping us? Well, of course, here in Cochise County, we have good old Gail Griffin. And back in 2016, she was able to convince the legislature to pass 2 laws exempting several large developments in Cochise County from any application of the Arizona Groundwater Management Act. Now, the Cochise County had voluntarily voted, the County Board of Supervisors many years ago voluntarily voted to try to meet the Arizona Groundwater Management Act, even though they're not required to. And so the county was doing things to try to make sure that not too much groundwater is being pumped to threaten sustainability. But Gail Griffin, who wanted to make sure that any developer and any farmer could do anything they wanted, got the legislature to exempt these developments from any application of the law. Guess what, though? Doug Ducey vetoed both of those bills. I was so surprised. And what did he say? We're not going to allow bills that get in the way of the 1980 Groundwater Management Act or take away from the work of the people that came before I came into office in protecting Arizona's water. That was a good moral position to take, and I was proud of him for doing that. Well, didn't really stop Gail Griffin. 2 years later, she's up to her same tricks, and all of her allies doing everything they can to undermine groundwater regulations to facilitate continued development at whatever pace and whatever style the developers themselves wanted. And news media is paying attention and basically saying, we're on our own. So, because the Arizona Groundwater Management Act has teeth, a lot of people who don't like government regulation are trying to figure out how to come up with an alternative that isn't controlled by the state, that's got more local control in it, and doesn't have as much teeth. To me, if you want to solve a problem, you need to put the hammer down. Just like a parent. Kids acting up, stop that right now. We can't do that in politics. This state wants to say, oh, please do the right thing, and then turn away and let you do whatever you want to do. That's kind of the culture, our political culture here. Libertarianism, laissez-faire. So anyway, so the rural people are saying we need a law like the Groundwater Management Act, but that's different than the Groundwater Management Act, that doesn't carry all of that baggage. So they introduced something called rural management areas, and they had about 3 different versions of it. You know, first one was really weak, second one got stronger, couldn't get passed, so they weakened it again, that couldn't get passed. So it keeps getting rewritten. But in 2020, they introduced these bills. They had 1 hearing and they had no votes on it. In 2021, that RMA bill was introduced again, didn't even get a hearing, let alone votes. So the state legislature is either making it harder for us to protect our groundwater, or they're sitting on their hands, as this article says. Rural Arizona is facing a water crisis, yet for 3 years, lawmakers have sat on their hands. Well, what do you do when the people that you elect to solve problems for you won't solve the problems? You do it yourself. So a scrappy little group of volunteers in the Sulphur Springs Valley called the Arizona Water Defenders decided, they looked at that Arizona Groundwater Management Act and they noticed a little known paragraph in the law that said not only can the director of the Department of Water Resources designate new AMAs, but citizens can designate a new AMA by petition and a vote of the people on a referendum. And so a handful of people said, the state's not going to do anything to help us. Let's do a petition drive and get the measure on the ballot and have the people vote in these Douglas and Wilcox groundwater basins about whether or not they want to be in an active management area to try to protect groundwater. So these 3 women, Marianne Capehart, she was head of the WaterWise program in Cochise County. This is Ash Dalkey. She's the president or chairwoman of the Arizona Water Defenders. And this is Rebecca Wills, who's their secretary. They did a petition drive, and they successfully got 2 ballot measures on this election. One for the Wilcox Basin, one for the Douglas Basin. And everybody in Cochise County who lives in those 2 basins is going to get this on their ballot. I think I'm very proud of these women. I've been supporting and helping them as much as I can. If the AMA measure passes, there will be no expansion of irrigated acreage. Existing irrigated acreage is grandfathered in. No new irrigated acreage can go in. So it stops the growth of irrigated agriculture. Large well owners above 35 gallons per minute have to monitor their pumping and report it so that at least we have data about how much water is being pumped and used. Wells that pump less than 35 are exempt, and existing users are grandfathered in. In addition, a local groundwater users advisory council has to be set up. It's appointed by the governor, but local people can recommend people to serve on the GUAC, it's called. I would hate to serve on a GUAC. Sounds like a clam in the Pacific Northwest. You know gooey duck, right? They have to, ADWR has to consult with the GUAP, develop goals for the AMA, and then develop management plans to achieve those goals over 50 years or so. It's very incremental. Public hearings have to be held. Citizens can appeal the management plan. So there's all kinds of public participation, but it sets into motion an effort to actually set up plans and regulations to try to get groundwater sustainability. So here's kind of the lesson, the upshot, the reason I'm giving this presentation is where are all those Riverview farms and the California pecan growers who are swimming in dough from other parts of the country looking for new places to expand, and they've been expanding in the Sulphur Springs Valley just over the mountain. Where are they going to go next if the AMAs are voted in on November 8th? We have no protections and no regulations in the San Simon Valley. And we already know, going back a decade and a half, that existing farmers are already concerned about out-of-state farmers coming in and drilling deep new wells. This is San Simon Valley. This is one center pivot irrigation alfalfa field by Riverview Farms for Coronado Dairy. That's one. They have something like 64 wells like this. They're completely changing the valley. The same thing could happen here. All right, I'm going to end. This is my last slide. I promised some best practices. So I sat and thought about this. What can you do? Well, one thing you can do that I didn't put up here is maybe think about banding together like those scrappy volunteers in the Sulphur Springs Valley and pushing for an active management area citizen petition here if we think that it's necessary. I'm certainly willing to work on it, and we can get a lot of help and advice from the people across the mountain. If they're successful, I think we should consider maybe seeking this out for ourselves. In the meantime, if you don't have a well yet, I recommend you drill it about 30% deeper than you think you need to drill it, because not only are we as the aquifer declining because of groundwater pumping, it's declining because of drought and climate change. For the first time in my knowledge, because we had so many dry winters in a row, several people in Portal lost their wells this spring before the monsoons hit. I don't remember exactly. Does anybody remember whose wells went dry in Portal? There were two people's wells went dry in June, I think. Yeah. Use drip irrigation and soil shade. That means, trees like mesquites and palo verdes will slightly shade the soil without consuming too much water. If you have mulch, spread it over the soil so the sun doesn't beat directly onto the soil. If you have shade screens or solar panels, agriculture underneath solar panels is now one of the hottest new trends across North America, and especially in the arid regions. There's been a whole bunch of research at Biosphere 2 by the University of Arizona. They're on the leading edge of what's called agrivoltaics. That is the pairing of agriculture and solar voltaics. And they've demonstrated that if you grow crops underneath solar panels that are high enough to let sun and air through, but provide some partial shade, you get greater biological productivity from your crop. You have lower rates of evaporation, higher soil moisture. Everything is happier. And the same thing, that green crop helps to cool the solar panels. And as solar panels get hot, they're efficiency in converting sun to electricity goes down. So the solar panels are producing more when they're over crops, and the crops are producing more when they're under solar panels. There's grants available for this. There's all kinds of people experimenting with agrivoltaics. That's something that we could do here and promote it with our small farmers. Conserve your rainwater. Slow the flow of water across your property in any way that you can. Put swales in. Put trincheras in. Where if you've got a little drainage coming down, slow the flow of the water down that drainage. Let organic matter fill in. Let the water soak in. You'll have more biological productivity, more infiltration into the soil. There's a whole bunch of practices under the label of permaculture doing that. I recommend you monitor your well depth. Don't just assume it's going to be there. Know ahead of time if your static water level is falling at the rate of a foot or two a year. Figure out how to get some kind of instrument down there and monitor and keep track every year, and then go to your neighbor and say, are you checking your well depth? Have you noticed whether your static water level is rising or falling? Suggest how they might check it, and then share your data. Talk to all of your neighbors and find out what's happening to your wells. So that, because most of us, these are the hidden waters. You can't see them. You have no idea what's down there. You just assume when you turn the faucet on, the water will be there. And the day that it isn't there is too late. And finally, think about our aquifer as a common pool resource. This is one of the problems with only thinking about private property rights alone. Private property rights are important. I like my private property, and I'm going to defend it from anybody who wants to take it from me. And I'm glad there are laws that help me to defend my private property. At the same time, I realize that we share a lot of resources. The air we breathe is a common pool resource. Nobody can own the air that we breathe. The water that we depend on underground is a common pool resource. We all share it. And we should be thinking about the kinds of resources that are common pool resources require different kinds of community collaboration and cooperation, and just thinking bigger than yourself, your property, your family. Think about us, our community, our future. That's what we need to do when we have a common pool resource. That is the end of my talk.